This is David F. Starr reporting from Spackle Gallery with Andrea Avery, Meet Your Neighbor, October 17th through November 30th. Enjoy.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the work that's up because it kind of goes from a different time frame, from the beginning of what I started doing, why I started doing it, and then to where I kind of am now. So I guess, where should I start? I brought notes just in case. My original inspiration comes from the little small town that I grew up in, which is called Chetek, and that's Ojibwe for pelican. And it's way up north, and it's about 2,000 people, and it's a tourist town. And so it's about 2,000 people during the year, and then summer comes along, and it's about 10,000 people. And so while I was living there, I had kind of a crazy childhood. My parents were young and had my brother and I, and so my dad decided that he wanted to move out west. And so they left us with my grandparents, and so they raised us for part of the year, and then I went with my parents the rest of the year in the summers. So I was raised in a very 1950s traditional atomic home in the 1980s. And so I had a turkey dinner with homemade mashed potatoes every day, and I mean, it was a really great environment to be in. And then in the summertime, we were shipped out to the west where I stayed with my parents, and my dad was a professional rodeoer and saddle maker. So I had these two very surreal different lifestyles that I was living that kind of meshed together. I lived with my grandparents till I was about 16 or 17, and then I moved back in with my parents, who had moved back to our home, and they had become police officers. So my mom is actually a jail sergeant in a county jail, and my dad was a sniper and a canine officer. And so during this time, I'd been living with my grandparents, and I had met all their friends, and one of them, Pauline, who I guess I could contribute a lot of how this is actually shown. She ran our city museum, which, if you can imagine a town of 2,000 people, doesn't have a lot in the museum. So, but she had like this museum in her basement of dolls, thousands of dolls, thousands of doll houses, and statues of white kittens. And I think that's kind of like where this all came from, and this idea of giving somebody a personality through either an animal they collect or an animal that I now saw Pauline as this white cat. Like, those two were associated together. So during this time, I had met all these people through my grandparents and through just the community I was raised in. I worked at the grocery store, and so I knew not only about these people in my small town, I knew who they were, what their kids' names were, what their grandkids' names were. I now knew what they ate, when they came to shop, when they needed their newspaper. And then I moved back in with my parents, and I now knew about their criminal life. And so it was this weird juxtaposition that there was these people that I saw all the time in the community, and then we all kind of had these secret lifestyles that no one really knows about. But I was in a position where my dinner conversation went from Sunday turkey dinners to hearing about vehicular homicide meth labs. So it was just this very weird thing to me, and that's kind of how all this work started. So sewing, how I got sewing is when I was little, because when I lived with my grandparents, when we were in trouble and they put us on timeout, my grandmother handed us an embroidery hoop and embroidery, and my brother got a comic book. So that was how I started sewing, and it was just a natural thing for me. It was something that was always seen as utilitarian, something never seen as artwork, and once I guess that it was just natural for me to have this kind of conjoined together. And one of the first pieces that I started is, when I started doing this, is actually the one that's back there on the wall. It's called Maggot Stitch. It's like, here's Monday's tea towel, and it's a kitten washing something on, you know, like in a wash bin. And I was wondering how they're supposed to be reflecting our daily lives, Monday through Sunday or whatever. And what do our lives really reflect? And so all this work is about procreation, death, religious views, I guess. And then you move over to the next piece, which is actually, I started doing these stories about people in my small town. This was about a neighbor that I had. It's called Meet Your Neighbor. The neighbor that I had, I thought was a really great guy. I'd see him every day when I went to the bus. And here he was a peeping Tom, and he was taking pictures of a little old lady that lived next to us. And so it was this, and it all started also because of an article we had in our small paper called Meet Your Neighbor. Coincidentally, that week he was in Meet Your Neighbor. And it was like, this is my favorite movie, this is my favorite author, my favorite color is blue. And I'm like, and you like taking pictures of Mrs. Peterson when she's not looking. So it was this idea that we all have these kind of skeletons in our closet, and how they kind of come together. And so that's how this work all evolved, and I've kind of continued on with that. The more painterly pieces are newer pieces, and they're all individual pieces, but I guess they came together quite well as a whole, and I think.
Well, I do have a question.
Yeah.
You said that you were given an embroidery book when you were in timeout.
Mm-hmm.
So do you ever associate when you're working with this as a sort of punishment?
No, not at all. Like, it was something to me that it was just, I think that was a way for them to control my craziness. And it was like to focus it in. And so a lot of these pieces are actually, are pieces from my grandmother's friends who, because we hung out with them when we were little, and they were retired. And so we were given the pieces or inherited the pieces. So a lot of these, like for instance this one that's here, I matched like thread width and color, and went in and took this artifact that was someone else's, who they did to commemorate a piece in their life. Like, I'm sure it's the same around here, but in the culture up north, like if you get married, one of the very traditional things you do is to make pillowcases for the bride and groom, or a tablecloth. So what I did was I took the story of the person that I got this from with the stains and the tears, and then added my own story on top of it. So I tried to figure out like what their story was, or how I saw that or portrayed that. But I always thought of it as a way of telling a story, and not actually as a punishment, I guess, really. I enjoy it a lot. It's something that I do all the time. And actually, even when I'm painting, when I'm stitching, I miss painting. When I'm painting, I miss stitching, and some of these are incorporated together. So.
When you appropriate a piece, do you have a piece of something in mind, or before, and you look for the perfect canvas for it, or does it come the other way as well?
No, that's a great question. Usually what I do is I have a story in mind. I write a lot, so I think it's really important to carry on the stories of people that are before you, because I think we all have important stories that should be shared. And so usually what happens is I come up with a title first, because it's the idea of the story. I write out the story, and then I figure out what would be the proper way to tell the story without giving all the information. Like
okay, that's fine. Well, I was just looking at this piece here, and I noticed that there's a lot of layers to it, and the title of the piece is two for you and none for me. Is that what it is?
Yep.
Yeah. And it seems on first glance to kind of sort of be about body image or something. It has sort of that feel to me, a little bit with the animal, and I really enjoy the animals in the pieces and stuff. But then there's this not only like these beautiful textures and stuff, and you know, a very time dated sort of time of like cloth and pattern on there that's got a nice texture, but also then there's these really interesting line drawings that are done. What is that drawn with? Is it a color pencil?
It's actually a patterning graphite.
Okay, yeah.
So it's a dress patterning graphite.
And then I noticed this man here has two pepes.
Yes. This is actually a story of someone who has two lovers, and like how they perceive their two lovers, and if one is secret and one is forward, and what they see in the other ones, and how the actual lovers associate themselves with the person as well. So it's kind of like a triangular thought process, like how do they all interact together.
Oh, interesting. Okay, well, that's why I thought it was fun in the story. I mean, it was such fun visual imagery that, like, it's a little Easter egg, it seems like, because as you dive into the piece, then you're like, wait a sec. So, oh, very good. Thank you.